Greetings to you all who have joined us on this, the third of this year, of the Policy Dialogue, SAPES Policy Dialogue Forum. Before we continue, I would like to request that you please support the SAPES Policy Dialogue Forum by liking and sharing this video on YouTube, and please subscribe to the SAPES Trust YouTube channel. Spread the word. So we are waiting for Professor Nzongola and Talaja. He says he's on. David, can you just ensure that he does join us? David. Can David hear us? David?
Yes,
David? Yeah, we're trying to get Professor Nzongola in. He says he's in there. We don't see him.
Let's just check if you used the right link.
Yeah, I'll give him the link for the panelists.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Let me just sure that is.
Yes.
Patron, there are two links. One is for the panelists. That's the one you should join through. If you join on,
how do I get them?
I send it to you. It's there on your screen. I send it to you.
Send it to me.
I sent it to you just now.
Yeah, but send it to my email because I'm not using the telephone. I'm using the email.
Yes, they're on your emails. They're on your email. That's one I sent to you. Yeah, it says for the panelist, not for the public. For the panelists.
Okay, let me look at it.
Anyway, let's start.
Yeah, go ahead, start. Yeah.
I'm sorry about that, colleagues. Today we're looking at the crisis in the DRC and the Great Lakes region, and not for the first time that we have turned to this, and it's a boiling pot. Most recently, for the last 30 years, one might say, we have had this problem. And as Nkrumah said, 56, 70 years ago, the Congo is the heart of Africa. Any wound inflicted upon the Congo is a wound to the whole of Africa. And it appears this is so true for many reasons, as we hear from our panelists today. The Congo has been very important in the recent history of the continent, not least since the 1884, when Africa was divided among the European powers. Also, more recently, we had, in 1998, a major war over the Congo, in which the DRC itself, Namibia, Angola, and Zimbabwe signed a pact, defense pact, on the 31st of July 1998, as a prelude to those four countries' involvement in the DRC, on the side of the DRC, against a combined force of Rwanda and Uganda. Are we back to this in 2025? This is something our panelists here, whom I will introduce, are going to look at. We have Paul Nantula, who will be our first panelist. Paul is Tanzanian, but he wants it known that he is from East Africa. Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, all. It's a true East African. More than that, he is also a Southern African. Paul has written widely on the subject of security, I can't think of a person who's more versed with the events in the Congo, in the Great Lakes, than he is. He'll be our first speaker. Then we'll have, after him, Claude Gabemba. I call him the Mswahili of Kinshasa. But I've worked with Claude for a long time. Claude has been doing a fantastic work at the Southern Africa Resource Watch, a very expert unit on the extractive industries in Africa, in Southern Africa in particular. And Claude, of course, will be exhibiting his knowledge in this field while he looks at the Congo itself in terms of the national question in the Congo and the record of the current leader there, Tshisekedi. Third, we'll have Michela Wrong, about whom we are most grateful that we're able to rope her in and to give a certain kind of relevance or particularity to the issue we're discussing, not least the role of Rwanda in this crisis. Michela is also known, or at least I know her from her work, in particular in the footsteps of Mr. Kutz, a book I've read 3 times over at the time, and 5 copies of which I've since lost to people who don't return books. And I'm due for another copy, Michela, if you can spare one. If I can find it. I haven't seen it in the bookshops for a long time. But it's a fantastic record of the last days of Mobutu, and in many respects, a kind of prelude to what follows in 1998 and thereafter. And more, and others will know her from that satirical piece involving one of my friends, Gitongo, who was in fact our guest at SAPES, by the way, Michela, speaking on that book some years ago. It's Our Turn to Eat, the story of a Kenyan whistleblower. Fantastic book. Then she has done the work on Eritrea, but I think more relevant to us is this book, Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. Really. Tony promised to pass on that copy to me, but I'm sure Michela will give us some insights into the book itself while discussing the Rwanda. Last but not least, I hope he has since joined us, Professor Nzongola Ntalaja. Have you joined us yet? Patron? Oh, there he is. Patron?
I can hear you.
There he is. Oh, at last. Ça va, Patron?
Yeah, it's fine. Can you hear me?
Great. I can hear and see you clearly. Thank you very much. I've just been introducing the other panelists here. I'm introducing you now. You'll be our last speaker. George Nzongola Ntalaja doesn't need much introduction. Certainly to those of us in African scholarship, he's as old as modern African scholarship itself, being a founder of an organization in which I grew into, the African Association of Political Science, which was founded in 1973 in Dar es Salaam, and he was there. And subsequently, I worked with him in the association itself, and then he spent some time in Harare, in charge of APS. He is part of the African scholarship, and we are working with him on the Pan-African Congress, which we are hoping to hold this year in Kinshasa, the 8th Pan-African Congress, and he's our key interlocutor in that regard. But on this occasion, he will give us an outline of the current conflict in the DRC and the Great Lakes, about which he has written before, a number of books that he has done. Maybe at the end of the day, if you can just send the titles to me so I can mention to the viewers at the end of this session. And more recently, he was the DRC ambassador to the UN. So he's very familiar with the current crisis before us. So without much ado, I now invite Paul and Tulia. I hope the map is available. Paul will give us an overview, assisted by a map which will tell us just where the DRC is, where the Great Lakes are, and in particular to show kind of the conflict as is unfolding across the eastern part of the DRC, and an account of what's been happening in the last few days. So, Paul, here you come.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Asante Sana, Prof. It is always an honor to be on a panel, to be invited by Professor Ibo, somebody who I have tremendous respect for, given your history and your contribution to African liberation struggles, your history in Dar es Salaam, where I was born and where my heritage is, at least part of my heritage. As you mentioned at the beginning, I do have an East African heritage, but then I'm also a Southern African, having spent a significant amount of my time in Southern Africa and working on Southern African issues. So it's really, really a pleasure and a privilege. I would not have missed this for the world, Prof. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's also really an honor to be sharing a platform with others that I've had an opportunity to either work with or be in their presence. I mention here Ndugu Claude Kabemba. Claude, the last time Claude and I were in a forum of this kind, it was again on the DRC crisis. And if memory serves me right, it was over the issues of the Sun City process, the Sun City Accords, and the inter-Congolese dialogue that was taking place. And there were quite a number of engagements that Claude and myself and many other Congolese friends and Southern African friends took part in. So indeed, it's almost like a circle. It's almost like a the circle is we're coming full circle. We're coming full circle with Claude on a conflict that again has triggered a major regional crisis. I've written and I've also mentioned in a number of commentaries on the DRC that, essentially paraphrasing Nkrumah, what happens in the Congo, because the Congo is so important, it is so central to African politics, it is unsurprising that what happens in the Congo does not stay in the Congo. What happens there, it impacts what happens around Congo. And so here we find ourselves again at the head of a very serious conflict that is getting worse by the day. Professor Nzongola, again, you're a lion of Africa, a lion of African scholarship. And so being in your presence is truly an honor, it's truly a privilege. Michela, I've read your work, and indeed it's so relevant. The dying days of the Mobutu regime very much, to some extent, lay some of the foundations of the crises that we're going to talk about today. I had 4 points that I just wanted to articulate in order to set up a strategic framing at a macro level. And we have there for the participants a map of the areas of control, or at least the areas of activity of this contraption that is referred to as the M23 organization. And one can see how that map is developing, how those control areas are growing. In fact, today I was talking to very, very good friends in Bukavu and in Kinshasa who were just giving an update of what is happening. And one of the things they said, these are colleagues who have been monitoring the conflict. In fact, they were here in Washington in October to warn about precisely what is happening right now. So it also speaks to early warning and the failure to heed early warning, because what is happening right now, I mean, these colleagues came here to warn, and then they went to Nairobi to warn about...
I'm sorry, here in DC, right? You're in DC?
Yes, in Washington, D.C. And then they went to Nairobi, again, on a mission to warn precisely of what is going on. So I was talking to them, and they told me that around Uvira, which is further south, if you look at this map here, towards Burundi, there's a lot of activity that is now taking place, a lot of fighting around that area. And 2 days ago, the M23 launched a fourth thrust northward, north of Goma, and that has sparked a lot of speculation as to what might be the purpose of that, given that the Uganda People's Defense Forces have deployed and actually threatened to deploy and then deployed in that direction. So we're in the midst of a crisis. Essentially, what I argue is that because when one listens to the warnings that have come out of the UN and so on, the warnings are that this crisis is going to become regionalized. My argument is that it's already regionalized. We are already there. We are already there. So now we need to begin to talk about what happened and what might be needed to get all these actors to pull back. Let me move to my presentation. The first point I wanted to put on the table for us to discuss is there's a major difference between the M23 that we saw in 2012, which seized Goma for, I think it was about a week, and the M23 of 2025, or maybe should I say the M23 of 2022, because that's when the current thrust started. There's a major difference between these M23s. It's almost as if they are completely different, at least operationally, very different. We see an M23 that is much more, from a military standpoint, the armaments that the M23 is showing in the battlefield are quite sophisticated. If we compare that to the armaments that we saw the M23 use in its seizure of Goma in 2012, it's really a world of a difference. We also see an M23 that is that appears to be much more organized than it was in 2012. And I think going back to 2012, if we refresh our memory, if we refresh our minds, the M23 was supposedly defeated militarily by a combined operation of the Force Intervention Brigade, which is the Southern African, Tanzania, Malawi, South Africa, working together with MONUSCO, and the Congolese army, such as it is, launched a push which defeated the M23. The M23, it actually broke up the M23 into two cohorts. One cohort ended up in Rwanda. The other cohort, which was actually a bigger cohort, ended up in Uganda, and it was disarmed and confined to Bihanga military barracks in western Uganda. The smaller one ended up in Kigali. But what is interesting is that the Rwanda at that time, the Rwandese government at that time appeared to be more amenable to international pressure. Because not only was the M23 cohort that ended up in Rwanda, not only was it disarmed, some of its leaders were placed under house arrest. And not only that, one of them ended up in the US Embassy in Kigali, and the US Embassy promptly transferred this individual to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court, because there was a warrant for his arrest. This individual was actually tried and remains in The Hague. And there's been a lot of analysis about the pressures that were exerted by the UK, by the United States, by the European Union, to actually have that occur. In fact, one of the leaders of the M23's predecessor, which is the CNDP, which is Laurent Nkunda, is still under house arrest in Rwanda. Now, fast forward to 2025, the levers of the international ecosystem are also markedly different. So not only do we see a difference operationally and militarily in terms of the M23, in terms of the lightning strikes that it has conducted ever since its resurgence, that resurrection of the M23, if you will, has also occurred against the backdrop of an international ecosystem that appears to be in complete disarray. If we've been following what has been happening in Europe, with the transatlantic alliance, Europe and United States, which appears there are lots of question marks around it. The European countries are very consumed with Ukraine and what might happen. And if one looks at the tension that is emerging between Europe and the United States over the American Vice President's comments at the Munich Security Forum, one sees a Europe that is completely consumed with this particular situation. And looking at some of the feedback coming out of the recently held African Union Summit, the European diplomats, at least a few of them, are basically sending a signal that Europe simply does not have the stamina to engage in this problem, the stamina that we saw back in 2012. So I think that's a very, very important part of the analysis, that this renewed conflict is taking place in the context of an international ecosystem that appears to be in disarray. But African countries are also part of the international community. You know, sometimes when we talk about the international community, we tend to forget African countries. So when we look at what's happening in Africa, when we try and tease out the joint East African Community and Southern African Development Community Summit in Dar es Salaam, clearly there are major differences of opinion between SADC and the East African community over what is happening in Congo right now. And one of the reasons why both regional economic communities have not been able to speak with the same vigor that they spoke in 2012 is precisely because of these differences. Not least reflected in how the leaderships themselves are relating. So there have been threats and counter threats by President Ramaphosa and President Kagame. If one looks at the South African press and comments that have been made by South African officials, both military and political, senior officials, there's a lot of anger in South Africa, and one would even say within the SADC region, about the engagements that took place between the SADC forces and the M23 prior to the seizure of Goma. And so far, different accounts have been given in terms of what exactly happened. But nevertheless, there's a diplomatic fault line. There's a diplomatic fault line there between East Africa and SADC. And I think part of SADC's frustration is essentially the East African community is insisting that the Kinshasa government must engage with the M23. The SADC is also quite frustrated with what it sees as a failure by the East African community to state categorically that Rwanda and the Rwanda Defense Forces are involved in a significant way in the current crisis. This has been a source of tension, and it remains a source of tension among other issues. So the levers, I would argue, of the African ecosystem are also badly affected by what is going on. If we talk about the United States, I mean, it's no secret that the turmoil that is taking place within the federal government, which is also touching on the foreign policy establishment, the foreign policy apparatus in the United States at the moment, is going through a period of turmoil. So it may well be that the M23 and its backers, this may be part of the calculus. That there was an anticipation that perhaps this was a good time to strike, looking at it from their perspective, given what is going on internationally and also what is happening within the African ecosystem. So I think that's the second point that I wanted to discuss. The third point is what are the scenarios? What might be? How does all this end? Looking at it from an M23 perspective, looking at it from a Rwandese perspective, what could be in the offing? I think the first scenario that a lot of analysts have talked about is de facto military and administrative control of North and South Kivu. That may be the first scenario, and a number of reasons for that. In terms of basically military facts on the ground that might create pressure in a political negotiation. But then at the same time, these areas are endowed with minerals, and these minerals are absolutely key in green energy and green technology. I mean, the rest of the world, China, Russia, United States, Europe, are moving towards clean energy. And when we talk about minerals like lithium, cobalt, which we use in our cell phones, which are used in the electronic vehicles and the EV batteries and so on, and all the India as well. India has come up with a policy on that. these areas are endowed with these minerals, and there are a number of UN reports, UN investigative reports that have quantified the amount of money that M23 in particular gets from its control of the supply chains of these minerals, right? So this de facto military and administrative control of North and South Kivu must also factor that in. The second scenario is the overthrow of Kinshasa, because the M23, again, going back to the differences of M23, the M23 of 2012 was not really articulating a broad national perspective. The M23 of 2022 to 2025 is articulating, is making noises about a larger national objective, the overthrow of Kinshasa. They're now part of an alliance, the Congo River Alliance, which brings various movements from other parts of the DRC together, led by Mr. Nanga, who was the president of the Electoral Commission, and he's been speaking. He's been making certain noises about that, and this has been articulated as an objective. Whether it's a final objective or not, it remains to be seen. But the overthrow of Kinshasa has been stated as one objective. So I think that could be the second scenario. The third scenario, which is even bigger than Kinshasa, perhaps, could this be an attempt to redraw the map of the Great Lakes region? It would not be a pie-in-the-sky scenario, because we've seen it before. We saw it in the First and the Second Congo War. And we saw the changes that took place, prior in Uganda and Rwanda, and the changes that took place after the First and the Second Congo Wars. So it would not be unrealistic, because indeed the Burundian forces are involved and have been part of these engagements, these military engagements, especially in South Kivu, where you also have rebel groups that are fighting against the Burundian government. I mean, when the M23 arrived at the Rusizi border post, and should Uvira fall, that's about 3 kilometers from Bujumbura. So it would basically be enveloping the Burundian forces from two directions. So again, you have Burundi, you have Rwanda, you have Uganda that has deployed, you have the SADC forces, you have South Africa that has said that it is going to reinforce its units, especially in North Kivu. So already we're talking about a regional scenario. How to get out of it? I tend to take the optimistic view that the Congolese, supported by the region, both SADC and East Africa, have been here before and have crafted a framework. The Sun City process, if one looks at the Sun City process, and I had the privilege of having participated in it, addressed the internal dimension of the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Lusaka peace process, which ran concurrently with the Sun City process, addressed the external element, which is the countries that were involved in the crisis. Added to that, the Pretoria Accords, which was a specific process that brought Rwanda and the DRC together. When one looks at the Nairobi process and the Luanda process, these processes are children of the Sun City, the ICD, and the Lusaka peace process, and perhaps even the Ituri pacification process. So the ingredients of conflict resolution have already been established by the Congolese, supported by their regional neighbors. right? And so to resolve the current crisis, I argue that we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel, because there's already an architecture that is in place. There's a history that has been in place. And I think the Congolese are showing remarkable agency. So we have seen the Catholic bishops that have been engaging in a track 2 diplomatic process with the M23, with Kinshasa, with Uganda, with Rwanda. And this is not out of nowhere. The Senko and the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Congo has a lot of experience, has a lot of history in this. There are a number of focal points, civil society organizations that are playing that are in the grassroots level, playing a role.
Sum up now, Paul.
Yes, playing a role of civilian protection, monitoring and documentation. So I think it's important, because in a crisis like this one, we tend to focus on the people with guns. But I think it's important to look beyond that, to look at the agency that the Congolese themselves are exerting, and the framework that the Congolese themselves are coming up. I mean, there was a very powerful statement that came out. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, by Congolese civil society organizations. So I think I'll stop there, having highlighted these 4 issues, these 4 areas. And once again, it has really been a privilege to be on this panel, and I really look forward to the interactive segment of the presentation. Thank you.
Paul, I'll be coming back to you for clarification, but I think I want to get the others to put their views on the table. Let me move quickly to Claude Kabemba. Claude. Claude.
Bonjour. Bonsoir.
Patron.
It's such an honor to be on this panel with some very distinguished panelists. It's thank you so much for this privilege. Sorry, I'm coming up with a flu, so please.
Yeah, you can see that. You can see that.
Yeah. So and Paul, yes, we have been following this conflict for 30 years. I've got colleagues who say they moved from Congo to go somewhere, hoping that every 2 years or 3 years they'll go back because the conflict would have ended. But they've gone forever, and the conflict continues. So, and Paul, thank you so much for that input, and you've been such a great contributor to trying to find solution to this conflict. Yes, Michela, yeah, we've read your books, we've quoted them. You've been such an inspiration, really writing on the history of the Congo. And I've got some of your books just behind me. So it's an honor to be with you here. Professor Ntalaja Zongola is that's my mentor. I think a lot of the things that we've come to articulate, we have gone through his writings. I think he's one of the most polished Congolese intellectual, and he has been such a great. He's been part of our intellectual drive, and it's so good to see you strong and continue to get involved in finding solution to some of the challenges that the continent is facing. SAPES has always been there, and Dr. Mandaza, thank you so much for continuing to create this space for dialogue. I think you can only resolve conflict through dialogue. There's no other magic solutions. It's when you talk that you find solutions. I want to because we are talking about how do we solve the problem. I just want to give my argument about the real problem we are facing. And after which is my key argument, which is focused on the Congolese state. I think the DRC, for the past 20 years, I've argued that DRC is a dysfunctional state. And now I'm coming to agree with others who have argued that, in fact, it's a collapsed state. It's not just dysfunctional, it's a collapse. It's collapsed. And I remember Marina Ottawa arguing that, and I think we've had differences on those arguments. I've been more on the side of dysfunctionality, and others have been saying it's a collapse. But looking at the intractability of this conflict and the internal Congolese problems of governance, I'm coming to be now leaning toward the collapse of the state. So the Congolese state, I'll say, and arguing to paraphrase Marina Ottawa, is that it only exists as a juridical fiction. And it may be very difficult to restore the Congolese state, given the difficulty and the scope of reconstruction that will be required to do that. And this war is part of reinforcing the collapse of Congolese state. So, so that is my principal, really, argument. And as I finish, I'll provide some 3 or 4 points on how do we then work to fix this, because for me, the problem is external, yes, but the key problem is how do you fix a state that can protect its people, its territory, and its resources. So I want to speak to 2 parts. The first part is really, I think we need to contextualize. We need to understand the Congo in the world politics. I think it's important because for me, this war is not just a Congolese war. It's not a regional war. It's not a Rwanda, Uganda, DRC war. It's a global war. It's a war that involved players beyond East Africa, beyond the Great Lakes. And I just want to contextualize why it is so. Then I'll speak to, I think it's also important to answer the question, how come a rebel movement called M23, which was defeated in 2012 by the SADC forces of South Africa, Tanzania, Malawi, working with the Congolese armed forces, has been reconstituted, and I agree with Paul, and become more sophisticated. What happened for it to come back? And I think it's important to explain that, because I think there are some simplistic explanation, or that it's just a linear approach where, boom, Rwanda, Uganda decide M23 go, and I think we need to contextualize how it has come back in the form and shape it is in. So let me start with I think the DRC has never been stable since the eve of its independence. And I argue in the last piece of paper, a newspaper article I wrote, I think 2 weeks ago, that the Belgium, when they left, they had established that the DRC is one of the richest countries on earth. And it was not acceptable to give it into the hands of Africans. And for some good reasons, because the DRC has played an important role in the life of Western economy and the modernization of Western economies. In fact, I'll even go and argue that the DRC has played a solution country to many of the Western challenges. The DRC has played a special role in the development and security of the West. You remember that the first economic enterprise in the West was the pneumatic tire business for cars. It was because of the Congolese rubber, which supported the Europe pneumatic tire business in 1988, that Europe could, that business could evolve. And that rubber was extracted through forced labor. And Congolese were taxed to go and extract the rubber. And there was a legislation which determined the amount of tax that the Congolese should pay in case they did not meet the required quantity that we're supposed to give. And that tax, because there was no currency, it was given in terms of the quantity of rubber. So it's important to understand that the Congo has always been part of a business for the West. Another is the Congolese uranium, which was used for the first atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan by the United States. And the Congolese uranium is one of the best in terms of quality and grade. And the Congolese, since that time, have never been allowed to use their own uranium. The Congolese have got no right to extract that uranium. Even today, it's still under the control of the West. Anyone who tried to extract, including the Congolese government, they will be found victim and punished. So it's important to understand that this uranium is still being viewed as an important reserve, not for Congolese, but for security of Europe and the West in general. Third is, you look at the Second World War, is the DRC copper that sustained the war machinery of the Allied forces, including Britain and the United States. There are some statistics that I picked up. In 1953, the Congo was the leading African producer of cobalt. As you know, cobalt today is one of the key metals that goes into renewable energy, green energy technology. But that time it was for military only. 86% of the African production, already in 1953. The DRC was producing 64% of diamonds, 60% of tin, tungsten and zinc mineral, 53%, and silver, 51%. And the DRC was the biggest producer of copper after Northern Rhodesia. But we know that today, Congo is the biggest producer on the African continent of copper with 2 million tons a year. And as you know, copper remains one of the key metal that we need to achieve a sustainable shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And what is interesting, and which is, I think you'll understand, I'm doing a comparison. What is interesting is that at that time, copper, cobalt were treated in Congo. And Congo was exporting finished goods to Europe. And there was already secondary industries which were created in the Congo to supply goods to Europe. But you'll understand that today, the entire continent, including Congo and the region, we are being challenged with the question, how do we add value to our minerals? But already during the colonial time, we were already adding value on the continent. But that was done by the colonialists. But today, the Democratic Republic of Congo has also a very global significance in the fight against climate change. I think Paul alluded to that, due to its geography and natural resources. Look, we've spoken about cobalt. Congo is the world #1 producer of cobalt. And cobalt is key for EV batteries and for energy storage. Lithium. Congo has just discovered one of the biggest reserves of lithium in the world, in Manono, in the almost 6 million tons of lithium. Coltan, very important for electronic. When the war started in 1996, that's when the importance of coltan increased, and the entire transformation of the war into a resource war was linked to extracting this coltan to feed the electronic business. And today, the electronic coltan remains an important metal for anybody who wants to dominate the world, because it's used in various sectors. So the DRC, we of course have germanium, copper, manganese, that the world is competing to access to secure sustainable supply needed to sustain the production of renewable energy. Now, I've been thinking, when you look at the configuration of the Congolese economy, which is mineral-based, the cobalt and copper and lithium, which are found in the south of Congo, in the Katanga province, old Katanga now in old Katanga and Lualaba provinces, cobalt has been, and copper has been controlled by the Chinese. 90% of cobalt and copper there is in the hand of Chinese. And China is the biggest supplier of green technology in the world, because it's got dominance over the control of these critical minerals. Then the East, where this war that Paul has so eloquently described, we have coltan, which is equally important. The Congo is the biggest, it has got the biggest reserve in the world. Now, coltan in this part of the country is extracted only artisanally. There is no industrial mining. I think people need to understand. And what is extracted is through hard labor by Congolese, by young Congolese who got no jobs, and they don't earn enough. Most of the money is earned by middlemen, by a network of syndicate, international syndicate, that include neighboring countries. And also that include Congolese themselves, especially the armed forces, the generals. They're all involved in this trade, illicit trade. The international certification mechanism that we put in place to trace and to ensure that this is a clean supply of coal has not worked. And I think a war like this one has amplified the illegality and how dirty the business is, because those resources which are entering the market are entering through a war that has become a resource war, because my sense is that the fact that to maintain the presence of that big army, M23 and the rebels, you need to have access to finance. And I don't think Rwanda or Uganda have got capacity, financial muscles to support such a. So it's access to these minerals that is supporting this movement, this rebellion. And the fact that they got the control now, the biggest cobalt mine or in Rubaya, gives them sufficient access to resources and the capacity to advance and advance rapidly, because they can sustain, pay their military, pay their soldiers. And you can see that the war is progressing quite fast, and faster than what we saw against Mobutu in 1996. So And let me just end this part to say the DRC presents itself as a solution country. That's the most strategic position of the Congo today. So I was arguing that the coltan, my argument is that I'm seeing the West trying to control coltan because the Chinese have got cobalt and copper and lithium. And my sense is that when we see a trade agreement or an MOU being signed by the EU and Rwanda, knowing that it's very difficult for Rwanda to supply a considerable quantity of cobalt from its own production, it's that approach from the EU, the West, to say we can't leave everything to China. We need to do whatever we can to also control this cobalt. So from that basis, my sense is that it's a war beyond just DRC, Rwanda, Uganda. It's a war of geopolitical positioning to control the Congo minerals. And that, I think it's important. But we need to know that the fact that the Congo was created as a free state, the fact that, you see, the King Leopold of Belgium was giving Congo as his private property, not because the West believed he was just a guardian of the West's interest. And the Congo was supposed to be a free-for-all, access to resources by the capitalist world. And I think that's important, and that has not ended. The way the West regard the DRC, but not just the West, the new powers have come to learn that this space is an empty space where we can all go and collect. And I want to tell you that the way, it's not just coltan where the war is happening, that is almost for free, but even where we've got organized extraction of cobalt and copper, the state still does not have hands on those minerals. Even collection of taxes is so difficult. So we have those problems. So and you have to understand that the Europe has depleted its resources. They don't have. It's the most dependent region when it comes to minerals for renewable energy, as we are transiting from fossil fuels. Europe has to find and access to these minerals. The United States is also very much dependent. But already by 1960, the United States had depleted its mineral reserve and was depending 100% on import of commodities such as chromite, manganese, tin, nickel, bauxite, and asbestos, zinc. So the United States is also very dependent. That's why when you hear President Trump say he wants Greenland, it's because this island is known to have abundant minerals, critical minerals that we need for the transition, or even Canada to become a province of the United States, is because Canada is known to have these critical minerals. So as we discuss the Congo and to try to find a solution, this global position of the Congo as a free-for-all has been strengthened by the vacuum of governance inside Congo. And there has been deliberate interference to ensure that the Congo governance continues to remain weak. And we've seen from Mobutu to President Tshisekedi that the leadership has not been to the level to resolve the Congolese problem. Now, that's one part. The second part, maybe as I speak about the leadership, let me just give a perspective for me, which I see as from the external global regional problems to the internal problems, which I think allows for these external factors to have an hands on Congolese minerals, to Congolese politics, and whatever it is that is happening in Congo, is the type of governance that we have seen in the Congo since 1960. To cut the story brief, let me speak of President Tshisekedi's governance, which I think allows for anybody to decide to go in the Congo and do whatever they want. My sense is that I've seen that there has been a tendency to reproduce Mobutu type of governance under President Tshisekedi. That has involved intricate web of personal family clientelism and ethnicity, which has weakened social cohesion. Now, you will see that as the M23 takes up territories, you see Congolese, just as they did in 1996, when the AFDL under Laurent Kabila was pushing to chase Mobutu out of power, Congolese are also clapping, applauding. As the M23 moves in, it's not simply because they lack the M23, it's because despite the way things are done internally. And let me say, there's no guarantee that any new government, any regime change will solve the Congolese governance problem. I think that's an important one. But my sense is that President Tshisekedi had the biggest chance in the world to fix the Congo. He comes from a tradition of opposition for 38 years with his father. But he comes into power, he does the opposite, totally 360 change of the way of running the country. He established a patrimonial and kleptocratic state. Really, there are serious problems. What you are seeing in the East, there are serious problems across the entire Congolese space. And this government is unable to solve some of these problems. And that you can only confront an external pressure when you have got social cohesion, when you are united, and there is no unity in Congo. There isn't even a small part of it. And that's, for me, one of the biggest problems that we are looking at. So, and we need to question just the way this regime has come in place, which has weakened society. You remember that Paul spoke about Nanga, who was the president of the Electoral Commission, is on record to say President Tshisekedi and President Kabila had a deal. That winning of President Tshisekedi did not come from the ballot box. It was a deal that was made. The one who won is somebody else. But for them, it was an African solution to African problems. That to avoid any crisis, let's give it to Tshisekedi. And it seems like President Tshisekedi agreed to take something which did not belong to him. And what he did, that particular scenario, is to bring Congo in the situation of illegitimacy, because the Congolese since 1960 has always faced the problem of illegitimacy of leaders, and it brought back that problem. Then we moved to the second round of elections, which was so badly organized, and again reinforces the problem of illegitimacy, and further created social divisions. So, and more important to the fragility of what we've seen, is the attempt by President Tshisekedi to want to stay all in for the third term. Because before the war came aggressive, as we've seen up to Goma, he was on campaign to change the constitution. And everyone who will oppose that was not welcomed. So these are internal dynamics that we need to continuously interrogate. And if, and I think as I conclude, I'll speak to some of those solutions. So for me, that is, I don't know how much time I have. I wanted to speak, Dr. Mandaza, about
we'll come back to you, Patron. Just to wind up now.
Yes, let me wind up. Let me speak and to just say that my sense is that if you are going to resolve the Congolese crisis, and if SADC, the AU, or the international community will help resolve this problem, it cannot be pushing and asking Rwanda not to intervene, or Uganda supporting the M23. As we've seen, there's no fair play on international arena. There's no pursuit of interest. Anything that is not controlled, like we're having those resources that where the state has got no control, other people are bound to come in and take them. So there are three things. I think I've spoken to the predisposition for Congolese leadership at all levels of society to act outside of the rule of law and revert to a democratic act. Corruption, nepotism. We need, if SADC and any other want to help the Congo, is to try and help to fix the state. And that fixing the state cannot be a one-off intervention, because the Congolese have gone to Sun City and have agreed on a format on how they're going to run the country. We've solved the problem. I think we need to hold Congo and work with Congo step by step. There's no need to send armed forces to go and fight when we had all these years to support the Congo to build its governance system and to build a strong army that can defend itself. A country of 110 million people with so much resources. I think the problem is not that Rwanda, Uganda, or the M23 are so powerful. The problem is that the Congo is too weak, and that weakness that we need to resolve. I've also seen the predisposition of Congolese leadership to accept outside influence on how to manage their internal affairs. How do we build a Congolese leadership that is authentic, that agree on an indigenous Congolese plan to move the country forward? But to do that, we need to stop how these leaders come into power through outside influence. And that is work that Congolese must do, but we need to hold Congolese to ensure that elections are properly organized. Every time we need to help them for a foreseeable time, not just once. We helped them they helped Congolese in 2006. Then we forgot about them. My sense is that there is need to hold Congo and work with Congo for such a long time until values are really sit and in society. And my sense is that we also have a Congolese leadership that is not capable of conceptualizing progressive developmental agenda that could respond effectively to the country's socioeconomic and political challenges. The level of poverty for a country that is so rich is unacceptable. The level of neglect, of dilapidated infrastructure, not across the country. The soldiers which are not supported, which are fighting but cannot be paid their salaries, it's a difficult situation to be able to protect that country. So these weaknesses need to be resolved if we are going to put an end to this recurrent conflict. You see, it can, in the future, it might not be just Rwanda, Uganda. Any other country surrounding the Congo can decide just to walk in the Congo when they've got anything that they want to do, because there is no defense, there's no unity, there's no cohesion. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Patron. It's very, very detailed. I will ask our audience to be patient. It's very detailed presentations here. It's almost difficult to intervene. Let me move straight away to Michela. You take up from the other two have left off and give us some insight into the role of Rwanda in this conflict.
Fine, I'll do my best.
The big man himself.
Yeah, I have to say, you know, as you probably know, I'm not the most popular person in Kigali. The book you mentioned earlier did not make me very popular with the regime. So, you know, I comment on Rwanda and I do so from the outside. The book focused on how Kagame had dealt with many of his closest colleagues, members of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, who he had, you know, the key men who invaded Rwanda in 1990, when the genocide, you know, and then these men played a key role in the government that seized power in 1994. And one of the points in my book was to say that Kagame, as he has assumed supreme power and focused more and more power in his hands, alienated and distanced himself from all these people, whether it was the case of sacking them, imprisoning them on usually trumped up charges of insurrection, posting them as ambassadors to work abroad, or when some of these key players moved, went into exile, set up opposition parties and denounced his rule, his response was to track them down, send agents, and in the case of Patrick Karegeya, kill them in exile in South Africa. And he tried to do the same thing with General Kayumba Nyamwasa. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I think what we're dealing with here is a very centralized decision-making process. So when people are speculating about what Rwanda wants and what Rwanda's intentions are, it's my belief that that we are basically dealing with the opinions and motivation of one man, which is Paul Kagame, who really is, as most people who have met him say, he's a control freak. He does not delegate. He likes to know everything that is going on. When he was surrounded by people who were his intellectual equals, maybe even his superiors, he was not comfortable with that and he got rid of them. And now he is running the show. So when we're trying to guess what Rwanda's intentions are, it seems to me we're basically guessing what his intentions are. One of the things that's been noticeable about this intervention in Congo, and this is typical of all the previous military interventions that we have seen, in which Rwanda has either directly gone into Congo or supported a rebel movement there, you know, which provides it with camouflage. But behind those rebel movements, you know, there's always the force of this very impressive Rwandan army. One of the features of this new intervention is it hasn't been discussed, debated, voted on by Rwanda's parliament. So this is very ironic when you think how much praise and respect Rwanda gets for having a parliament, you know, a vibrant parliament in which women in particular are well represented. In fact, you know, the parliament is toothless and it's really just a showcase parliament, as we have seen over this recent deployment. So I just wanted to say that I think what we saw, it's been very interesting hearing how the M23 has changed from what it was back in 2012. I think what we saw for people who sort of constantly track, you know, and watch Kigali and watch what Paul Kagame says, is we saw a change probably around 2023. One of the key moments was when Paul Kagame went to Benin in West Africa. He was asked to give a speech and he started talking about how the Rwanda kingdom, the old Rwandan empire that was done away with by colonial power Belgium, that it used to extend beyond its current borders, and implying that the colonial powers had messed up Africa by drawing across Rwanda's natural borders, and it used to extend into Congo, into DRC, Uganda, and Burundi. And this is not a new discourse, the idea that the colonial powers, during the scramble of Africa and the Treaty of Berlin, created all sorts of future problems. It's hardly new to anyone who studies Africa. But the emphasis he was giving it did cause a lot of alarm bells to ring, because why was he bringing it up in 2023? Why was he bringing it up when the M23 was already active in Eastern Congo, this new M23? And was this really just a preparation to provide an irredentist sort of foundation to a rebel movement that Rwanda, it was already very well known by then that Rwanda was arming and equipping and supporting it. So I think that was an important moment. And ever since then, you've seen that theme of Rwanda's old borders used to extend further than they currently do, being taken up by loyal intellectuals that form part of the regime, and you could see it also in newspaper articles. By the way, people who really do know about Rwanda's history, not me, will tell you that it's a very inaccurate depiction of the history, because while 19th century the Napoleonic figure Rwugiri did in fact conquer a very wide area, sending his warriors into those areas, there was also a lot of contestation and a lot of pushback from local chiefs, and Rwandan forces were pushed back. So where you draw the line, the borders is highly debatable, the pre-colonial borders, I mean. Anyway, so I think we don't have a huge amount of time. What I wanted to focus on is, it seems to me that what we're seeing now in the Kivus is Rwanda cashing in on decades in which it has very cleverly made itself useful to the outside world. I've often spoken about this, that Kagame, it seems to me, is the cleverest African leader in terms of spotting, identifying Western, not always Western, but in particular Western needs and preoccupations, and then supplying his donors, his allies, his partners with a neat and tidy response. And that has made him a favorite, despite what his government does, both at home in Rwanda in terms of suppressing the opposition, jailing journalists, killing political rivals, but also abroad. And I think he's been cashing in on that those credits which have been accumulated over the last few years. So what we know is classically that Kagame has been the man who has stepped up in terms of providing peacekeeping troops to combat the jihadist threat around Africa, particularly acute these days in Western Africa. We've seen a series of West African leaders going to Kigali, having long talks with Kagame, and we're not privy to those talks, but it's fairly clear that security and Rwanda's ability to help provide security for those governments against jihadist attack must have been a part of those talks. And I often hear reports of the fact that there are already Rwandan military personnel who are maybe wearing local uniforms, but already in position in Benin and Guinea. And we know in the past they've been stationed in Mali. As we know, they're also stationed, a very important presence in Central African Republic. And the key card that Kagame has played is of course, in deploying his forces in Mozambique, where both Italy and France have major hydrocarbon interests, which were under threat from a local jihadi group. So that won him a lot of brownie points in the West. The other key issue that won him brownie points in the UK, and that has now changed because we have a new government since last year, was Kagame's extraordinary offer to accept unwanted asylum seekers who were arriving in the UK. It was extraordinary because Rwanda is most of the densely populated countries in the world. So the idea that it would take unwanted asylum seekers when it already had a heavy caseload of refugees, something Kagame constantly talks about, was pretty amazing. But it's interesting that that offer was then echoed. You saw politicians in Germany, in Denmark, in Holland, talking about a Rwanda-style deal or even a Rwanda deal, because they all have rising concerns about immigration, and the right-wing parties in those countries are pressing for action. So that again was one of the cards that that Kagame played very successfully. And I think what you can see now is, the previous speakers have already spoken about this extraordinary lack of concerted reaction that we've seen compared to what we saw in 2012, where it was quick and it had a very swift effect, that united donor front, which included the World Bank. A colleague of mine recently just compiled a list of who gives Rwanda most aid. And it gets 1.3 billion a year, more or less. And of course, the biggest donor is the World Bank, which gives $520 million a year to Rwanda. After that, we're looking at the US, and after that, France, and a little scattering of European countries. So that was all leverage that could have been brought and applied to Rwanda once it was very clear to everybody that Rwanda was supporting the M23. And we've had this very strange, limp scattering of responses. Universal condemnation at the UN crisis meeting that was called sorry, it was 2 weeks ago, I think, wasn't it? That there was the Security Council, the UN Security Council staged an emergency meeting. We saw denunciation after denunciation, with Rwanda being specifically named as not only backing the M23, but having its own troops inside the Kivus. I understand from diplomats that, in fact, this oft-cited figure that Rwanda has 4,000 troops in Congo is very much an underestimate. I don't really know why journalists keep using it. It's more like 7,500 troops stationed inside Congo. So that actually would have meant that when fighting for Goma was going on, that was a bigger force than the M23. This 1.3 billion in aid going to Rwanda, some of it takes military form, and when you look at pictures of the M23, it's fairly clear that no rebel movement in African history has ever been dressed or equipped like that. And you can also then immediately see the similarities in equipment and uniform that those so-called rebels have with the Rwandan forces that are also operating and are being photographed on that side of the territory. But just to look to the responses, what we had early on, Germany acted and said it would be suspending aid talks with Rwanda. The UK keeps teetering on the brink of announcing something. It cancelled its asylum deal last year, but that was because we had a change of government, and the incoming government did not think that was the right way of dealing with the immigration problem. The UK has yet to unveil something substantive. Belgium has been very vocal and very outspoken in its criticisms. It was quite amusing the day before yesterday, to see that Rwanda, clearly sensing what was coming, decided to announce that it would be cutting off aid from Belgium. And therefore, this was the Rwanda's way of seizing the initiative, making it look as though it was sanctioning Belgium, whereas Rwanda is obviously the recipient of any aid. But I thought that was a smart diplomatic move, and I think it caught Belgium on the hop. But anyway, that I think that's $22 million worth of aid, which has gone. The German aid has gone. That's $30 million worth of aid. The US. I think I keep hearing that we can expect something from the US, but as you know, was earlier mentioned, there is uproar in America at the moment, and everyone's eyes are very much on this hiatus period in which there's enormous strains coming to bear on the relationship between the EU and the US, all sorts of question marks over the war in Ukraine, and so America's eyes are elsewhere. And I think the timing of this intervention was not coincidental. That was spotted this was spotted by Kagame and Kigali as a good moment to go in hard because the world would be distracted. Having said that, in the time we've been on air, James Kabarebe, who is the former defense minister of Rwanda and the former head of the armed forces in both Rwanda and Congo, at one rather extraordinary period of Congo's history, has just been sanctioned by the US government, as has a key M23 leader. So the US has taken the first, as we've been on air, it's taken the first key action on this one. Turning to the European Union, the European Union, a bit like Africa, is split on this issue of what to do with Rwanda. It's clear that Belgium has been pushing for sanctions. There are a lot of parliamentarians who feel that it's absolutely outrageous that the European Union signed this memorandum of understanding that we have previously already discussed. Not only that, but the European Union is funding $40 million worth of support to the Rwandan forces deployed in Mozambique. And that's also being denounced by European parliamentarians. They voted last week and took 443 European parliamentarians called on the EU to sever these agreements, scrap them, and sanction Rwanda. But the EU is really proving very reluctant indeed to take that action. And I think that's fairly obvious that the reason for that is France's dependence on Rwanda, not only in Mozambique, where it wants its hydrocarbon, its liquefied gas installation to continue to be protected, but also by the Rwandan peacekeepers, but also because of its interests in Central African Republic. So this has led to a very sort of messy situation, and I've heard some sort of diplomats speculating about, well, if Rwanda is ready to walk away from Belgium, they can walk away from the West. And look, the Rwandan foreign minister has just announced that he will be going off to Moscow on a trip, and we know that Moscow has been courting both the government of Congo and the government of Rwanda. Personally, I feel that shows a profound misunderstanding of how Paul Kagame thinks and works. Paul Kagame wants to be acknowledged, respected, and admired in the West. He likes being invited to Davos. He loves to tread the red carpet. He is very a great sports fan. He turns up for matches, here in Britain, in London, at Arsenal, because his Rwanda is actually sponsoring Arsenal, the football team. It's also sponsoring Paris Saint-Germain and Bayern Munich. And I feel that this is where Kagame, who is a former refugee with the grievances and perhaps some of the complexes that former refugees might tend to have, wants to be respected and acclaimed in those forums. And I don't see him going to Moscow with that same level of alacrity and replacing his visits to the Arsenal football matches with visits to the Bolshoi Ballet. But anyway, we will see whether that there is a real danger of pivoting. Pivoting towards Russia. I think the last point I'd want to make is I wrote a story with a colleague at The Guardian about 2 weeks ago because it seemed to me that one of the elements that was being ignored in this story is that Rwanda is, as a society, is paying a high price for what it is doing in Congo. This has not been cost-free, its intervention. One of the things that we noticed looking at satellite photos was the way in which Kanombe, which is the military cemetery in Kigali, had the number of graves had dramatically increased over the last 3 years during the period in which the M23 has been active. And this is because Rwandan soldiers operating clandestinely and secretly inside Congo have been dying in large numbers. And I sat down and tried to count the graves. So did my colleague. It's quite a hard thing to do, but we ended up feeling that we could see over 600 new graves. We also spoke to sources who have also been spotting this trend, and they were talking that the deaths amongst the RDF, the Rwandan Defense Force, could be in the thousands. There was a very bloody part of the war, high casualty rate for the Rwandans during late 2023 and early 2024, where a lot of young Rwandan soldiers were dying because the contractors, the military contractors on which Tshisekedi had relied, a company of military contractors had bought a lot of drones, and they were using those drones to attack the RDF, and they were not prepared for those kind of attacks and were taking a lot of casualties. And you can see the sort of funeral notices and on opposition Facebook pages and websites, and occasionally on Twitter. So I certainly hear a lot of reports from Rwandans I know living in exile who say they hear, that the families they are in touch with back in Rwanda, a lot of casualties and a lot of death. The problem is if you have an autocratic regime in which, a president can send his forces to war at the drop of a hat without talking to parliament, where the newspapers are sycophantic mouthpieces for the regime, where the only the only opposition leader with any sizable following can't really leave her house and wasn't allowed to run in the elections, and where civil society has effectively been politicized and emasculated, and all the journalists, all the independent voices are in prison or have gone into exile. Is it going to matter that there's a steady stream of dead bodies coming back from Congo? By the way, on that drone issue, the Rwandans, what they did to stop that was to buy GPS spoofing equipment. This has been detailed by the UN in their latest report, and it effectively meant the drones could no longer be deployed in that way. So I think we have a situation in which Kagame is not getting the kind of pushback that he did in 2012. This will embolden him. I still think there's going to be more pushback than he wants. And the point I would make, and I've been making this since the start, is Rwanda is a very aid-dependent country. Yes, it benefits from smuggled goods, but it also relies on donors to provide health services, education services, and that is an effective way of applying leverage. So when the European Union officials say that, they don't want to lose leverage and they don't want to cut off, and I sort of think, well, this is the moment to use your leverage. Unfortunately, they seem to sort of think that there's always going to be another occasion in which they will have to sort of double down and use the influence and the points of pressure that they have cultivated all these years. I would have thought now is the time. Okay, that's probably all I have to say.
Thanks, Michela. Most fascinating. You have added a very important dimension to this conflict. I think some of us were in the box a few weeks ago when we raised the question of the elephant in the room. And I think Nzongola and Talaja will be speaking on that. the extent to which Kagame is feared in the region. Very few are able to mention his name at all. Some of us did so a few weeks ago, and I was amazed at the kind of accolades we received for having the courage to mention it. That this is an elephant in the room, you know? Yes.
Yes, I would agree with you. I'm astonished in particular by the way in which, obviously the regional superpower, the continental superpower, which is South Africa, has been utterly humiliated during this latest encounter. Really confronted in a very, very personalized fashion by Kagame during the East African Summit, and that there hasn't been more pushback. I found that very quite astonishing.
Yes, I think on that note we'll turn to Professor Nzongola and Talaja. Not last speaker, but certainly not the least. Patron, it took a long time to come to you, but you have the floor now, and there's no limit except your own in the circumstances. We need you. Welcome, Patron.
Thank you. And SAPES Trust for inviting me to participate in this Policy Dialogue Forum. I'm happy to see people that I haven't seen for a long time, and of course, new faces as well. My presentation today is going to focus on the crimes of President Paul Kagame of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of the Congo since the Rwanda genocide of 1994. I will discuss 3 questions. 1, who Paul Kagame is. 2, what he seeks in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And 3, what harm he has done to our country, its people, and its territory during the last 30 years. Who is Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda? The Rwanda Patriotic Front and its military wing, the Rwanda Patriotic Army, later renamed the Rwanda Defense Force, was an organization of Rwanda refugees in Uganda, most of whom had never seen their homeland. Paul Kagame, for example, left home when he was 2 years old in 1959. This is when many Rwandan Tutsi fled away from the pogrom to which they were subjected to by the Hutu majority in Rwanda. When the RPA, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, started its invasion of Rwanda under Hutu rule in October 1990, Kagame was a major in the Ugandan People's Defense Force, the UDPF, as its interim chief of intelligence. He was at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, USA, enrolled in a course for senior officers. Major General Fred Rugema, the Rwandan officer and the second in command of President Yoweri Museveni as deputy chief of the UDPF and deputy minister of defense in Uganda, took the RPA to Rwanda. He was killed on the battlefield on the second day of the war, apparently by his own officers. Both, the RPA continued its attempts to overthrow President Juvenal Habyarimana of Rwanda, but the Rwandans were defeated by the French, Belgians, and Mobutu's best equipped and trained special presidential division in the fall of 1990. The President of Uganda, Museveni, recalled Kagame from Kansas for him to assume the leadership of the Tutsi army. These people continued to fight Habyarimana, but then the regional powers in Eastern Africa took the initiative to have these two parties, the Habyarimana regime and the Tutsi group, to go into peace negotiations at Arusha, Tanzania. As it turned out, the last meeting took place in Dar es Salaam on April the 6th, 1994. That evening, as the plane flying President Habyarimana and his Burundi counterpart, President Cyprien Ntaryamira, was about to land at the Kigali airport, it was brought down by a missile, one that only the RPF could possess, according to the evidence found by two judges, one French and the other Spanish. What Kagame was waiting for is described in the following quotation from Dr. Theogene Rudasingwa, former battlefield doctor during the RPF's invasion of Rwanda, Secretary General of the RPF, Ambassador of Rwanda to the United States, and Chief of Staff to President Kagame until he went into exile in 2005. Quote, "The truth must now be told. Paul Kagame, then overall commander of the Rwandese Patriotic Army, the armed wing of the Rwandese Patriotic Front, was personally responsible for the shooting down of the plane. In July 1994, Paul Kagame himself, with characteristic callousness and much glee, told me that he was responsible for shooting down the plane. Despite public denials, Kagame's culpability in this crime is also a public secret within RPA and RPF people. The President Kagame is skillful in his lying. Recently, for example, he was asked by journalists whether he had 4,000 RDF soldiers in the DRC. And we heard from Ms. Wrong that the number was much even larger than 4,000. His response was, "I don't know." Can you believe that an autocratic chief who wins elections with 95% of voters would not know the deployment of his own soldiers? What does Rwanda seek in the DRC? Kagame has two lies to justify his crimes in the DRC. The first is that the DRC government not only let the Hutu extremists who were involved in the genocide of 1994 use Congolese territory to make raids into Rwanda, but also provides them with weapons and ammunition for this activity. As most of you do know, the United Nations, had approved the French Turquoise operation of June to August 1994 to help manage the humanitarian demands of approximately 2 million Hutu Rwandans who had sought refuge in the Congo. And at that time also, the French not only allowed the Rwandans to come into the Congo, then known as Mobutu Sese Seko's Zaire, they allowed the former Rwandan army and its militia, the Interahamwe, to move across the border with all their arsenal of war, including aircrafts, vehicles, arms, and ammunition of all kinds. In 1996, Rwanda and Uganda started the First Congo War to remove Mobutu from power and replace him with Laurent Désiré Kabila. When the 7-month war ended with Mobutu's demise, approved by the United States, his long-term supporters, Kagame's Rwanda had the opportunity to destroy the weakened Hutu forces. Rwanda had the control of DRC security from May 1997 to July 1998, with Colonel James Kabarebe, an RPS officer, as the chief of staff of the Congolese army. Even after both Rwanda and Uganda lost full control of DRC in July 1998, they invaded the DRC again on August 2nd, 1998. Alpha Zimbabwe, Angola, and Namibia helped the Laurent Kabila's army to push the invading countries out of most of the DRC. They succeeded in sponsoring Congolese rebels to attempt the overthrow of Kabila until his assassination in July 2001. Moreover, under the presidency of Joseph Kabila, which was from January 2001 to January 2019, Rwanda was invited on at least 2 occasions to join the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the FARDC, to push the FDLR out of the DRC back to Rwanda. Kagame knows well that the FDLR does not present a danger to his regime. We hardly hear of any attack by the FDLR inside Rwanda, a country that probably has the best trained and the best equipped army on the African continent today, with sophisticated weapons from the US, Israel, France, Poland, China, and Turkey. The FDLR is simply an excuse for sending RDF troops into the DRC. The number of Tutsi killed by the Hutu in the genocide, approximately 800,000, is not comparable to millions of Congolese killed by Mr. Kagame's military machine since 1996. Kagame's second lie, and the most stupid, is that he is supporting the 23 of March movement, better known as M23, to protect the Tutsi of the Congo, who, according to him, suffer from ethnic hatred and discrimination in our country. The DRC is the second largest country in Africa, with 2,345,410 square kilometers, 26 provinces, 145 territories, and 450 ethnic groups. Why is it then that we have no problems with 7 of the other countries with which we share borders, except for Rwanda and to some extent Uganda? And why should Tutsi be the only group being persecuted in the DRC? The majority of Tutsi in the Congo do not agree with Kagame, and no neighbor of Rwanda is waging war with Kigali in defense of the Hutu majority, whose oppression as second-class citizens under Kagame is deplored by patriotic Tutsi like Dr. Theogene Rudasingwa. There is no discrimination and hate against Tutsi in the DRC. We have Tutsi in major government positions since the presidency of Mobutu Sese Seko, whose longest-serving chief of staff was Barthélemy Bisengimana Rwema, from May 1969 to February 1977. Born in Rwanda and a graduate in engineering at the Luvanium University, now the University of Kinshasa, Bisengimana brought Rwandan Tutsi into government and business affairs. Today, we have Congolese Tutsi in high positions, including Antonio Kinzo, the Chief of Staff of President Felix Antoine Tshisekedi Chilombo, Alexis Gisaro, Minister of State for Infrastructures, Lieutenant General Jacques Ichalingonza Nduri, Deputy Chief of the Army High Command, and General Pacifique Masunzu, Commander of the 3rd Military Region, which comprises North Kivu and South Kivu. In 1998, then Colonel Masunzu disobeyed Kagame's order to join his war to remove DRC President Laurent Kabila from power. As a Congolese Tutsi, Masunzu told Kagame that he will not be a traitor to his country. Kagame sent numerous commandos and helicopters to assassinate Masunzu in his mountainous region of Minembwe in South Kivu. The commandos and the helicopters never found Masunzu, but the bombs carried by the helicopters killed countless of Congolese Tutsi, the very people that Kagame claims to be protecting. So what do Kagame and Museveni want from the Congo? Minerals, and particularly strategic minerals in high demand, as our friend Kabemba explained it to us. These minerals are on high demand for the 21st century economy. The DRC has most, if not all, the major strategic minerals on Earth. The reason why China is so greatly involved in the Congolese mining industry, and the United States, the European Union, and Canada do not want to be left behind in the competition. One of the most important mines that the Rwandan put their hands on is the Rubaya coltan mine in North Kivu. Experts tell us that Rwanda earns $800,000 a month in revenues from this mine. In addition to North Kivu, Rwanda wants to take over the provinces of South Kivu, Tanganyika, and a portion of Maniema. For Uganda, based on statements made by General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, the son of President Museveni and Chief of Staff of the Ugandan People's Defense Force, its main interest is the Ituri province. This would give Uganda full control of Lake Albert and its rich resources in petroleum, fish, and other goods, the Ituri rainforest and its numerous resources, plus minerals and excellent land for agriculture. Land is the other thing Rwanda needs. The RDF has been moving peoples from their villages and towns in eastern DRC to make room for overpopulated Rwanda, whose citizens need land for agriculture and housing. This is needed in addition to our abundant resources in minerals, forests, and land for settlement and agriculture. Little Rwanda wants a larger space to provide a better environment for its people. General Kagame's crimes in the Congo. Rwanda has committed all the three categories of crimes in international law: crimes against humanity, crimes of war, and crimes of genocide. It is amazing that the international community, beginning with the African continent, considers the Rwandan genocide of 1994, in which 800,000 Tutsi and Hutu were killed, as being more important than the millions of Congolese women, men, and children who have been massacred by orders of Paul Kagame since 1994. The first Congolese killed were collateral victims of Hutu Rwandans being pursued for vengeance, whether they were genocidaires or not, from the Rwanda-Congo border through the equatorial forest all the way to the border between the DRC and Congo-Brazzaville. The new Rwandan authorities themselves did acknowledge that the number of Hutu and Congolese killed between 1994 and 1996 was about 200,000. Now, this is a very low number, since one count in the city of Mbandaka, Equatorial Province in northwestern Congo, came up with 400,000 people for Mbandaka alone. The arbitrary but Rwandan dictated massacre of Hutu flying far away from Rwanda was nothing but genocide. Many Hutu were also killed in Rwanda in the same manner. Kagame, who pretends that there are no Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa in Rwanda but just Rwandans, recognizes only the genocide of Tutsi, but not that of Hutu and Twa peoples. On February 1, 2023, the second day of his 6-day trip to the DRC and South Sudan, Pope Francis, in his message in Kinshasa, called attention to what he called the forgotten genocide in the Congo, which is much larger than the Rwandan genocide. Exact numbers are difficult for lack of better record keeping, but estimates go from 6 to 10 million people killed during the First Congo War, 1996-1997, the Second Congo War, 1998 to 2003, the first occupation of Goma by the M23, Rwanda's militia, for committing crimes in the Congo, 2012-2013, and Rwanda's major invasion of the Congo from Bunagana to the Ruzizi Plain, June 14, 2022 to the present. Rwanda, which has raped over 600,000 Congolese women and girls, massacred millions of Congolese men, women, and children, and plundered billions of Congolese resources in strategic minerals, forests, and agricultural goods, has never been punished as it deserves for its crimes, including genocide. During my 20 months as the permanent representative of the DRC at the United Nations in New York, I pleaded with the Security Council to impose strong sanctions on Rwanda, to no avail. The DRC must reinforce the FARDC, our army, with new officers trained in military academies, and increase the number of young recruits who can bring energy and patriotism to their work. Such a strengthened and well-equipped army will protect our country from foreign invasion and demand reparations needed to repay the harm inflicted to the Congolese people in the past. We cannot depend on anybody else to save us. Thank you.
Thank you, Patron. Thank you, Professor Nzogola and Talaja. A very important statement there. Almost as if you were speaking from the UN itself.
No, I'm not there anymore.
We have almost run out of time. I would like to begin with the first speaker to make your final comments, and then end up with Professor Nzongola again as the last speaker. So, Paul, your reflections on what has gone on since you spoke first. What are your conclusions? Just a minute or two. Paul? I can't hear you, Paul.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay. No. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof, for giving me this opportunity to round up my thoughts. I am certainly in agreement with everything that my co-panelists, with all the issues that my co-panelists have raised, from the situation that the DRC finds itself from a state building perspective is certainly a big part of the analysis. The Sun City Accords, the Inter-Congolese dialogue, actually one of the principles of the Inter-Congolese dialogue recognized this problem and set about creating a framework for how the Congolese state could be rebuilt on a democratic basis. The 2006 election in Congo, in which South Africa demonstrated a major solidarity by transferring its election equipment for that election. I think it was the first time on the African continent that an African country had taken its election equipment in terms of the counting, the balloting, and all that, to assist another African country to conduct its polls. Those elections were supposed to have paved way to a process of rebuilding that state on democratic lines. At some point, the parliament was quite active. The parliament exercised its oversight role. The parliament had, in fact, if one looks at the list of issues that the post-2006 Congolese parliament addressed, it really became a very, very interesting case study of how a parliament could exercise its independence and its authority over the executive. So there were quite a number of things. That is not to say that there were no problems. But I think much of that was pulled back by what Ndugu Claude Kabemba noted, that for some reason, Congo's leaders have tended to gravitate towards the mode of leadership that Mobutu Sese Seko bequeathed to that country. I think the coming of Tshisekedi, there was some euphoria given he's the scion of a tradition, of a democratic tradition. I mean, the UPDS that his father led was one of the biggest opposition formations in Africa. Very solid, very resilient. And so in that sense, it was really a lost opportunity. So I really think that this issue, when we talk about solutions to the current crisis, there's a need to revisit the Congolese state in terms of rebuilding it on a democratic basis, and then looking at issues of legitimacy. Because you see, even security sector reform, it flows from political legitimacy. Because then the soldiers know what they're fighting for. The soldiers have a sense of cohesion. Military effectiveness, it flows from democratic legitimacy. Once there's no legitimacy, then it becomes very difficult. So I think that's the first point. Then the second point really is this regional dimension of the crisis, and how we can arrive at a ceasefire, how we can address issues of sovereignty, how we can address issues of aggression, because aggression is a crime under international law. I think we should not forget that. Aggression is a crime under international law, of how this can be addressed. And as I mentioned in my brief, I think the Congolese and their regional neighbors have come up with a framework in which these issues can be addressed. The question is there political will to actually come around the table and to move forward, drawing on lessons from the Sun City Accords, the Inter-Congolese Dialogue, the Lusaka Peace Process, and the Pretoria Accords? I think the big issue now is whether that political will can actually be mastered. So I think that's where I'll stop in terms of
Thanks, Paul. Thanks very much for your contribution. Thank you, and I hope you survive the cold in Washington D.C. and until you come back home. Patron Kabemba, Claude, your last words.
My last word is that the Congo has everything that any country needs to become a real well-run superpower and well-distributed revenues and resources to all the people. The Congo can survive, does not need help. The abundance of resources from hydro, from minerals, from forests, from water, from land, the Congo can feed the entire continent. The Congo has got the clean water resources, 52 of the continent. 120 million hectares of arable land. All the minerals that the world needs to shift from fossil fuels to net zero are in the DRC. Then you start to ask why a country like this will experience a problem of neighbors like Rwanda, Uganda. And for me, it's about the people. I think leadership, that we need to build a new type of leadership to emerge in the Congo. If we don't do that, it will be difficult. Secondly, I want to say the fact that the country is rich in natural resources does not mean it's bound to be dysfunctional. It's not, this resource curse is not bound to be like that or to sink in conflict, really. And I think the DRC is dysfunctional and conflict prone because of poor leadership and lack of state administration and organizational capacity in the state. So there is need to really look at leadership and a new way to rebuild the state. The DRC has chosen to follow an electoral democracy. How do we help the Congo to reinforce that? That's internal. Externally, I want to, because the issue Rwanda raises every time, the FDLR, and Rwanda has made it very clear that it's got the right to intervene in Congo for its security. So as long as Rwanda believes that the FDLR are there, it can intervene anytime. So how do we take out that reason? As the international community, as the region, what is the mechanism that we need to put in place to take out that reason that is advanced every time as a key one to intervene in the Congo? And there has been a relationship between Rwanda and the DRC government to try and fight those negative forces. As Professor Talaja has said, there have been initiatives, but it seems we are still failing to get rid of them. I think we need to think together with the government of Rwanda. How do we solve your problem? Because here we are saying we need to solve the Congolese problem. We've said we need the government to negotiate with the M23 and so on. Is it possible for Uganda to negotiate with its rebels? Is it possible for Rwanda to solve its internal problem? Is it possible to help that situation so that there is a possibility for these countries to work together, collaborate, have collaboration regionally to build development for the people of the Great Lakes region, for the continent? We have a small window of opportunity as a continent, and Congo plays an important role to lift this continent. So I think there is need, and I think South Africa should not be tired. after what happened. They should continue to get involved. SADC should continue. I think they need to be some level of continuous engagement between SADC and the Eastern African bloc to find a solution to the key problems of Rwanda, of Uganda. The DRC is a problem of democracy, of leadership. We need to solve it. We need to solve the Rwanda problem of FDLR. And also Uganda problems of every time. He's got problem of rebels in the Congo that he needs to come in every time to fight them and so on. So we need to solve those three key problems. But there are also profound other problems. As a professor, the issue of land. But the issue of land can be solved by, we are going toward regional integration. Africa in regional, continental trade agreements. We are going toward movement of people. So those should not be a bigger problems if we believe that we are working toward a much integrated African continent. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, mon patron. Thanks very much. I hope you recover from your flu. Huh? You don't sound good, but you performed okay. Thank you very much indeed. Michela?
Yes, thank you. Just to close, I'm going to take up that point you raised earlier of the elephant in the room, which is the apparent successful intimidation by Kagame of other African leaders, who really seem to sort of be browbeaten sometimes into silence by him, especially when you see his performances at various African summits and meetings. And I think you get the impression that African leaders are sort of taken aback by the sheer aggression, ruthlessness, defiance, and rudeness of his interventions. They also often are taken aback by the fact that he will tell the most amazing lies in public. For example, during this confrontation with Ramaphosa at the East African Community meeting, he sort of claimed that Ramaphosa had admitted to him that the Congolese army had killed the South African peacekeepers, not the M23. I mean, I've spoken to a defense expert, and that isn't what happened. So Ramaphosa would not have said that. And having followed Kagame for several years, he is quite capable of saying absolute, obvious untruths in repeatedly, in public situations where he's being filmed. He has no compunction about that. But I think African leaders are often taken aback by that and the sheer aggression of his performances. And the one thing I would say is what we know about bullies is they give up when they are confronted by strength. And I often point to what happened with Paul Rusesabagina, where you had this hotelier who became a human rights activist, who then became a thorn in the side of the regime, lived abroad, had moved to the States, and was kidnapped, lured back to Rwanda, accused of terrorist activities and sentenced to 25 years in jail. And he was sprung from jail as a result of a concerted campaign by the US and by Paul Rusesabagina's family, which involved some Hollywood stars and human rights campaigners. And it was quite interesting to me because a lot of people who were supposedly established analysts on Rwanda were predicting right up until the moment where Rusesabagina walked free that Kagame would never free this man because he had made it absolutely clear in various speeches and various pronunciations that he regarded Paul Rusesabagina as a terrorist. And just like that, Rusesabagina was free and is now happily living in Texas. And I think what that shows is if you do present Kagame with something he understands, which is force, a muscular force, military force, or money cutoffs, aid cutoffs, the response is very swift. This is a man who reacts in a very transactional way with other societies. And I think one of the problems with South Africa is it got so used to, during its own liberation, to having a sort of steady, subtle, conciliatory inclusive reconciliation process between its majority and minorities. I don't think that's the way Kagame works. I think South Africa, as a result, is finding itself really struggling to deal with him. But there are plenty of examples of what he does respond to, and I would like to see more African leaderships applying those lessons.
Thank you. Thank you, Michela. And again, we look forward to reading your books again. Those who haven't read, I still say the best for me is the one on the footsteps of Mr. Coutts. It's so relevant even now to the current DRC situation.
Yeah.
And of course, the one on the big man himself, the big man gone bad, I think, very current indeed. Thanks, Michela. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mon patron, Professor, your last word. Yes, sir. You're muted.
We don't go. Am I understood?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I can hear you. Okay. We don't owe anything to Rwanda. The FDLR has been there since 1994. We've given Rwanda opportunities to get rid of FDLR. They don't want to get rid of it because it gives them an excuse to invade our country. They say that the Congo is maintaining this people. These people are a nuisance for us. They are there, they engage in mining resources in the Congo. They are also involved in raping women. We don't want them in our country. We'll be glad to see them out. But Rwanda doesn't really want to get them out, except if they want to get them and kill them. They don't want to negotiate with them. And then they ask us to negotiate with terrorists like the M23. We cannot do that. I told the UN in New York, every time I spoke, I said, we will not negotiate with terrorists. You don't negotiate with you terrorists in France, in the United States, and Britain, and so on. Why do you want us to negotiate with our terrorists? We can't do that, you see. And we even heard President Lorenzo of Angola saying that, well, Tshisekedi does not want to negotiate with and he says that, well, he negotiated with UNITA. Well, the UNITA was a different matter. And the UNITA, most of them were Angolan citizens. Many of the people in M23 are not Congolese at all. They are people infiltrated from Rwanda, you see. And so we don't see any reason of negotiating with them. The main culprit is Rwanda. We want to negotiate with Rwanda, see in what way we can work together as neighbors and not continue these crimes against our people. Secondly, the SADC and other communities in Africa, we don't want to say that they are not useful. They are very useful, and we welcome their support. But we don't want to see like what happened in Sun City, where they forced us to negotiate with people who were rebels. And these people, some of them who had no training whatsoever in military skills, they were incorporated in our army. And this is what we have an army where many of the people are not people who had gone through military training, who did not do anything. Many of them came out of their rebel groups as generals and colonels and so on, when they had no training whatsoever. And today we have them in our military as generals and so on. We don't want that. I think that was the big mistake at Sun City, because I refused to go to Sun City. I told Etienne Tshisekedi, who was my leader, that I would not come to Sun City because we had done everything we needed to do for the Congo at the Sovereign National Conference. We had a very, very good plan for the country. We went with the National Conference to examine what went wrong in our country since independence and how we can chart a new way for the country. And we came up with very, very good resolutions. But then the people who didn't want the national conference to succeed, mostly the United States and the European countries, what they did was to force us to go to the city. And that thing did not really help our country, because Joseph Kabila was working with the Rwandans, was not working for the Congo, he was working for foreigners. And this is why the country, Tshisekedi inherited a very bad deal. And unfortunately, he didn't do what he should have done in terms of making sure that we really have an army that is capable of protecting our country and being able to fight against the invaders like Rwanda and Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Patron. Thank you very much, our panelists, for job well done. This is one of the most engaging discussion, where we are compelled, even me as moderator, to hardly interrupt any of you. So rich was each presentation. And of course, happily, we have good technology. All this has been recorded. It's on YouTube. It's recorded to posterity, one might say. And you can revisit it at your leisure. I'd like to just say that we have had a joint summit of the East Africa community and SADC, and the resolutions are on the table. And as Paul said, we hope that the regions remain engaged with the Congolese situation. It's not the best of situations in terms of the record so far since 1994, but it's better than nothing. I think it is only an opportunity that we have as Africans to resolve our own problems. And I think that we as academia, as opinion makers, we should continue to give support to the regional and continental efforts to resolve the problems in the DRC and Great Lakes area. The discussion today has provided enormous insight into the complexity of the problem that confronts us, but we dare not give up. We continue. Thank you. Again, I'd like to just plead with those of you on YouTube, please support the SAPES Policy Dialogue series by liking and sharing this video on YouTube, and please subscribe to the SAPES YouTube channel. We have an enormous number of people. It's a very important forum. It has grown over the last 15 years into something broader than just the Southern African region. It's now global, given the number of our Africans in the diaspora across the globe. And I would dare say even on the moon, we have Africans out there in the diaspora. And secondly, just to say that next week we have an urgent policy dialogue on the Zimbabwe crisis. Those of you who are following events, there is something happening in Zimbabwe, something akin to 2017, and many Zimbabweans are anxious that 2017 is not repeated without them taking the opportunity to ensure that we put in place some transitional arrangement, and hence the discussion next week is on the National Transitional Authority, how to implement it, its implications, and indeed how we can start the process through a national conference. Professor Nzongola referred to the national conference in DRC, and I remember he was in Harare that time when he went off to the DRC, Congo. The national conference is a very important forum in such countries as we find ourselves. Congo is not alone in this regard. Most of our countries are burdened by the national question and the problem of the state, weak states. We are mere territories, most of our countries, not nation states. And this is a big challenge. And so we'd like to invite you to listen in and even participate in the discussion next week on the Zimbabwe transition and the need for it. Thank you again. Thank you to our panelists, Paul, Claude, Michela, and Nzongola. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. We have our Congolese